David Cameron has promised this deal. It's supposed to be more freedom, less money, and I think local governments heard a lot about the less money, and it's time to start hearing a bit more about the freedom. So one obvious thing is local government finance. And we know the balance of funding isn't really working at the moment. Now actually, if you look at our NLGN's projections on the impact of the cuts, actually if you take education out of the pot, the local government will be raising about 40% of its revenue from the council tax by the end of the Parliament. From there, it's actually not very far to raise 50 or even 60%. And you could probably do that through the imaginative use of charges, some tweaks to the council tax, maybe even hypothecated taxes to keep particular services going. So I think the coalition should signal pretty early on that this review it's doing of local government finance next year is actually going to result in significant change. I think another area where the coalition needs to signal it's really committed is around the place-shaping role, because if you look at these big outcome-based contracts for worklessness, you've got free schools, you've got police commissioners, GP commissioning, there's a real potential to fragment not only local democracy, but the kind of joint commissioning that we expected to see from area-based budgeting. So the coalition does need to signal it's committed to that. One really easy way of doing that would be to reinvent and strengthen the existing duty on local authorities to cooperate with other local service providers. Now that's largely symbolic, but it provides a starting point for a conversation. And I also think we're not really very clear what area-based budgets are going to include yet. If you take things like schools and health out of those, they're probably quite small. But I think the coalition should signal it's prepared to experiment much more boldly. So, if a local authority can make a case that it should have a couple of years as Commissioner of Police Services and that it can use that time to transform the local criminal justice system, maybe we should give them the opportunity to do that. I actually think that the coalition has quite a coherent philosophy on localism, and I don't think it's really explained it well enough to people out in localities. So one of the really big changes, I think, is that local government, partly because of initiatives like Total Place, has come to see localities as as these kind of complex interlinked systems of services, and we're trying to redesign those around the needs of consumers. And that's a really good thing, but the coalition, I think, starts from a slightly different place. They see localities as collections of services, as collections of schools, of hospitals, of GP practices, and the key thing for them is that each of those services is very accountable locally. And that's very coherent, but it comes back to that point about area-based budgeting and place shaping. It does fragment things, and we need to come up with new ways to glue localities back together. I think one of the key things that we'll be looking for, and that probably the sector is looking for from the Localism Bill, is a greater sense of clarity and stability in the policy environment. They have quite enough to be getting on without they're dealing with the cuts, without having to deal with huge amounts of uncertainty around things like local enterprise partnerships. So that's one area where we'd like to see just a bit more clarity and guidance over what the powers are going to be, what the settlement's going to be. I think there's also some scope to be quite radical in there around things like mayors. We'd like to see a strong offer to local government on taking up more mayors, more mayoral powers. And I think it'll also be really interesting to see how the government treats things like local referendums, which have the ability to be quite destabilising if they're implemented and used in the wrong way. I think local authorities are quite prepared for more civic activism, to hear strong messages from their citizens, but they don't want to become California. And the danger is always that what people want, if they don't deliberate about it, is better services for less money, and there's a point where that just becomes unsustainable, as Arnold Schwarzenegger has discovered.